Okay, great. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on the annual Climate Trends and Impact Summary for the Great Lakes Basin. I am Meredith Muth from the NOAA Climate Program Office, and I also have the honor of serving as the U.S. co-chair for an annex on climate change impacts under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which we'll talk about briefly a little bit later. But the new climate information product that we're going to discuss with you today, like so many others, all starts with a hallway conversation sometimes. And so I'm extremely proud and excited to see these ideas become reality based on the hard work of so many people that you'll be hearing from today and many others. In particular, I'd like to quickly recognize the Great Lakes Integrated Science and Assessments Program, also known as GLWQA, for their leadership in pulling this together. The purpose of this webinar is to introduce a new product for the Great Lakes Basin, and in doing so, two things. Number one, discuss the key findings from an assessment, a scientific assessment of climate impacts and trends in the last year in the basin. And two, to provide an opportunity for this community, all of you, to share feedback on how we can improve future iterations of this product. There will be a little bit of tennis in the webinar going back and forth between speakers, so I will take the first swing and pass this to Kim, who will be our MC here at Lisa, and will walk us through the agenda and introduce the speakers. Thank you, Kim.
All right, thank you, Meredith, for kicking us off here today. So again, this webinar is meant to provide you an overview of the annual climate trends and impact summary for the Great Lakes Basin. And we'll start off today with some background information to give you an idea of how and why this product came to be. And then we'll spend a majority of the webinar walking through the document itself, and you'll get to hear directly from the people who put each section together at that point. And then we'll wrap up with some planned improvements for future versions of the document that we've already received feedback on. And then we'll spend the remaining time taking questions or feedback from anyone participating in the webinar. And since we will be walking you through the document, we encourage you to open it from your browser and follow along in the document itself as we walk through it. And the link to the English version of the document, or the PDF, has been shared in the chat box. So for those of you who aren't familiar with BlueJeans, you open the chat box by clicking the chat button on the right-hand column of the BlueJeans application, and the link to that should be visible to everybody right now. So I encourage you to open that link and follow along with us as we walk through the document. And also, if you have a question or comment that you think of as we go along, feel free to type it into the chat box, and we'll keep track of everything, and we'll get back to it at the end of the webinar. But for any of that, I want to acknowledge all the contributing authors and organizations listed here who played a very integral role in getting all the information for this product together into one coherent document. So this includes Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Midwestern Regional Climate Center, and a few different branches of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So putting this product together was truly a binational effort. But I will not be the only person speaking today. We have a number of our contributing authors on the webinar to speak for the sections of the document and the process that they were involved in. And this slide is just here to give you some faces to go with the voices that you'll be hearing. So you've already heard from Meredith with the NOAA Climate Program Office, and you'll hear from her again next. Right now you're listening to me. I'm Kim Channel with the Great Lakes Integrated Science Assessments, or GLWQA. And you'll also hear from my GLWQA colleague, BJ Bali, and then we will have Frank Sigliniaks with Environment and Climate Change Canada, Jonathan Weaver with the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, and Brent Lofgren with the NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Meredith to give you some background on how and why this product came about.
Great, thank you so much, Kim. Let me indulge you for a moment for some quick background on what we mean by Annex 9, which was in the title of the seminar. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, for those of you not familiar, was first signed in 1972. It is a commitment between the United States and Canada to restore and protect the waters of the Great Lakes. And it essentially provides a framework for identifying binational priorities as well as implementing actions to improve water quality. And on the U.S. side, it's coordinated by EPA, and on the Canadian side, it's coordinated by Environment and Climate Change Canada. Now, during the negotiations, because it's frequently renegotiated, in 2012, Canada and the U.S. both governments realized that it was time to incorporate some climate change components. And so they established a new annex, Annex 9, to address again, the current awareness as well as future impacts of climate change. So prior to this, there was no commitments, let alone an entire annex dedicated to this topic. So a really big change for the agreement. Now, over the past 6 years, we've been focusing on the 3 areas listed on the screen. 1, building on our understanding of climate change impacts in the Great Lakes. 2, making this information available to those that need it so that they can proactively take action, and this includes the other annexes in the Water Quality Agreement. And 3, using our domestic programs to address these impacts as well. I'm going to focus on, in particular, the second one, making information related to climate change available. Next slide, please. Now, there are several existing efforts, both in the U.S. and Canada, related to increasing the access, availability, communication of climate change information in the Great Lakes. Now, from a binational perspective, an excellent example, for those of you who have not seen it, is the Great Lakes Climate Impacts and Outlook Report. This began in 2012 and is released every 3 months now and available in English and French with many partners on both sides of the U.S. and Canada. Now, the focus of this report, it's usually 2 pages, is on weather and water level conditions, the impacts from the last 3 months, and climate outlooks for the next 3 months. So a relatively shorter time frame than broader climate change. This product has been extremely well received in the community, and the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement proudly gets the word out about this product. Now, moving forward through conversations that we've had with stakeholders in the region, as well as some of the other annexes, and I'll mention those in a little bit, there's identified kind of like a gap or need, like what is your wish list for provision of climate information? And there was a desire to help synthesize the information that's out there, identify new research, and address these longer-term climate trends. And so Annex 9, which is pulled together a diverse group of experts, many on the phone right now from the U.S. and Canada, to form a small team that would scope and produce a new product that would meet these information demands. So next slide, please. Now, the new product presented here today that we'll be walking you through is the first annual Climate Trends and Impacts Summary. It is a prototype report, but we hope it'll be sticking around if it's useful. The overall goal was just creating a really nice, tight, easily readable package that will provide a summary of the past year's climate trends, notable climate relevant events, and new research assessments and relevant activities in the context of the Great Lakes. Again, providing it in a timely annual perspective and a very succinct summary. Now, the first intended audience is primarily the other annexes in the agreement, and this includes topics such as habitat and species, nutrients, and lake-wide management, but it is intended to, of course, have a much broader reach as well. So in developing this, we made sure that we thought about where we could essentially get the biggest bang for the buck and make it readable and accessible to decision makers at all levels. And once more, I'd like to reemphasize very much a binational product from design, data sharing, data analysis, and it's just been a tremendous opportunity to further strengthen our collaboration in this region. So now the good stuff, the actual report, I'll pass it back to Kim, who will begin walking us through the specific product and results.
All right, thanks again, Meredith. So now that you have a better idea of where this product came from and why it was needed, we are going to walk you through the document itself. So again, I encourage you to open the document using the link that was shared in the chat box. If you haven't already, it'll be much easier for you to follow along that way and read the pages. So let's get into the content here. So this document is 6 pages long and it has 4 major sections. So it starts with a general overview of the document, with the major highlights of 2017. Then the climate trends section is the largest section in the document, taking up 3 out of the 6 pages with an annual overview and then more details on the specific trends that we saw. Then there's a page on the major climate events of the year, and the document is wrapped up with a page summarizing the new research, applications, and activities relevant to the Great Lakes in the year 2017. So this is the part of the webinar where you will hear from the people who were responsible for gathering all the relevant data and information and figures and putting each of these sections together. So you'll hear from them soon, but I will start you off with this first page, the overview page of the document. And now you'll see why it's helpful to have the document open in a separate browser, because these screenshots are not necessarily meant to be readable unless you have really excellent vision. They're just meant to be here to guide you in terms of where we are in the document. So this first page it serves two purposes. It's meant to serve as an overview of the document itself, as well as a standalone one-page summary of the major climate highlights of 2017. Really for anybody who doesn't want to or necessarily needs to read the rest of the document with all the data and the figures, this gives a pretty good general overview. So it starts off with a brief summary in the top left, some of the interesting and important things that happened in 2017 that are then further explained in the rest of the document. And then there's a graphic next to it with arrows designating the trends of certain climate variables. So for example, air temperature was above average in 2017, so it has an up arrow, whereas ice cover was below average in 2017, so it has a down arrow. It's just a simple graphic to give you an idea right off the bat of what different aspects of the climate looked like in 2017 compared to the long-term average. And then the map graphic that goes with it also lists what we deemed to be the three major climate highlights of the year, which were high precipitation, high water levels, and high temperatures. And then these three highlights are all summarized in the bottom section of this page, starting with high precipitation. So in 2017, the entire Great Lakes Basin experienced above normal precipitation in the winter and in the spring, especially in the Ontario region. And then parts of Michigan also had pretty high precipitation in the fall. We had a pretty wet fall. But it was the heavy winter and spring precipitation that led to our next highlight, which was high water levels. So these heavy springtime rains in the Ontario Basin led to a record rise in water levels on Lake Ontario over the course of 6 months, which culminated into major flooding on Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River. It impacted shorelines all the way from Toronto to downstream to Montreal. And this really was the biggest story of 2017. These floods were unanticipated and destructive. They caused severe property damage, shoreline erosion, road closure, and evacuations. So you'll see quite a few additional references to this flooding event and its drivers throughout the rest of this document, because it was so important, and there were a number of climate factors that played a role in it. And then our last major highlight is the high temperatures experienced across the basin in the winter, and then again in the fall when the eastern part of the Great Lakes had some unusual warm spells. So this first page is just meant to provide an overview of the climate stories of 2017, and then if you want to know more about them, the rest of the document provides quite a bit more detail and explanation with figures and data, starting with this next section on climate trends. So this section is meant to provide more detail, again, with data, actual numbers and figures to further explain those climate highlights that were just summarized on the first page, as well as a few other interesting trends that we saw last year. And to present this section, we have two of the lead section authors, BJ Bowley with the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments, and Frank Ziglenieks with Environment and Climate Change Canada.
Hi, this is BJ Bowley. I'm with the Great Lakes Integrated Science and Assessments, and this first page of the climate overview section is kind of a summary looking at the annual state of the climate across the region. So later in the section, you'll see that we broke it up into climate highlights, which might be referenced more as a weather type of situation in a climatic context. But for this page, what we wanted to do was provide a summary of the trends and the averages across the region along the top of the page there. What that is, that serves as kind of an annual narrative. So it summarizes temperature and precipitation conditions across the region in context of the entire year and by season, and then there's a little bit about what the trends over time have been. Below that, we wanted to show the annual temperature and precipitation anomaly maps. And what you're seeing here were provided by our partners at ECCC, and they should be noted that the temperature and precipitation in this case do have different periods of record. The temperature map there is an anomaly map relative to 1981 to 2010. So it shows the departure from that long-term average. On the right there, that's using a merged product of the Canadian precipitation analysis and the NOAA multi-sensor precipitation estimates, and that are radar-derived products and corrected with gauge data. So you're getting a good spatial view of what's happening with precipitation over time. The downside of that is it's only available for a shorter record. So it's only available from 2002 onward. So that period of record on the right side for those anomalies was a bit shorter. But what this allows us to do is look at the cumulative effect of the entire year. So with temperature, on the previous slide, you heard Kim talk about how the winter and fall were warm. Well, the spring and summer were near normal to slightly below average. So when you average that out across the basin, the year came out just looking a little bit above normal. So it's kind of nice to see that annual value, but it does hide some of the variation going on at that intra-year time scale. Below that, we also wanted to summarize some of the annual variables for the hydroclimate. So we've got variables, information on water temperature, ice cover, water level, in depth, precipitation and evaporation broken down by lake basin, and then can also have the long-term average there for each variable. And the information on the period of record for those long-term averages are available on the bottom in the figure caption. But really what this served to be is, since this section served as, is since we're talking about climate and then highlights in the following section, this is something that can be replicated and standardized from year to year, so we can have a consistent frame of reference every year. So in the highlights section, that stuff might change from year to year, but this one we're hoping will remain fairly standard, so you can have something that doesn't change too much from year to year, and we can compare the reports. So that's just a quick overview of that section. I'm going to hand it off to Frank from ECCC to talk about the next slide for temperature and hydrologic highlights. So, next slide.
Yes, this is Frank Seglenet from Environment and Climate Change Canada. And on this page, in the next two pages, we get into a bit more of the detail of the different hydrological components. In particular, on this page, we're looking at land temperature, lake water levels, and lake water temperatures. And so from the top left, starting on the top left, we present the temperature anomaly. Now we're digging it down a bit more, because now we're just presenting for the winter season of 2016-2017. And you can see that all the colors on the map are yellow to red, indicating temperatures about 1 to 5 degrees Celsius above the 1991 to 2010 average, with the highest values seen in the northern part of the basin. And as there is no blue on the map, it means that there were no areas where the average winter temperatures were below average. And as indicated in the text and previously talked about, the fall months of September and October were also very much above average in the Great Lakes region. The graphs on the top right show how this past year fit in with the historical record. These graphs show the average annual temperatures for the land areas of each lake basin going back to 1950, with 2017 shown as the black bar on the right, along with the 10-year running average shown as the gray line. Obviously, the absolute value of temperature depends on which basin you're looking at, but the trend for all the lakes is that the land temperature has been rising over the last few decades, with 2017 continuing that trend. Going to the next graph, although the lake levels were above average for all the lakes during 2017, the graph in the bottom left shows that the monthly average lake level of Lake Ontario exceeded the historical record for all of May, June, and July. And as has been discussed, anyone living along the shores of Lake Ontario knows that there was quite a few consequences of these high water levels, and certainly it was probably the big story around the Great Lakes in 2017. The historical record for lake levels goes back to 1918. So definitely these were the highest levels for Lake Ontario that have been experienced in the last 100 years. And finally, on the lower right, we see the average annual water temperature for each of the lakes, again, since 1950. As with land temperature, we see a trend of rising water temperatures over the last decade, with this last year continuing the trend. And this trend is particularly dramatic in Lake Superior and Michigan-Huron, as you can see on the leftmost two of those of the graphs. If you're looking at it in your not in your browser, but if you can see the detail, you can see how much it's risen in those lakes over the past few decades. And you can also see that the average annual value for 2017 came in well above the 10-year average for all the lakes. And this also, if we don't show it here, but if we dig even deeper for just a little color that's not on this, when you look at the monthly variations in the lake water temperature, you see that a lot of this rise is actually caused by higher temperatures in the fall. So again, depending on what time scale you're looking at, you can get different information. But I'm going to pass it back to BJ for the next page.
All right, thanks, Frank. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this page. What this page shows is the precipitation highlights, both rain and snow for the basin. And so in the upper left-hand corner there, we've got a precipitation anomaly map similar to what you saw on the first page, but this one's only for spring. So when we talk, you've heard it referenced several times, we had heavy spring precipitation across the region, resulted in flooding along Lake Ontario and down the St. Lawrence. Kind of one of the interesting things about this graphic is it shows that heavy concentration of precipitation in the eastern part of the basin. And actually some areas in eastern Ontario and western Quebec saw more than twice the normal amount for the spring months. And when we say spring, we're talking climatological season. So this is March, April, May. It was also worth noting that following the spring, summer and fall precipitation was more varied across the region. And when you average all the seasons together, it came out, which is being above average across a lot of the region. Michigan, for example, that year had the wettest year on record across the state on average. So it was definitely a wet year across the Great Lakes Basin. Right there, we break precipitation down by lake basin and look at the trend over time. So each of those colored bar plots on the right there show the average precipitation or total precipitation by year from 1950 to 2017. And as Frank said before, that gray line on there is a moving average. But really, 2017, all of the basins average anywhere from 10 to 50% above normal precipitation for the region. And it continues a general upward trend since the late 1980s, early 1990s across the region. So precipitation has increased from that time period, and 2017 showed that it relatively continued. Below that, we kind of have an interesting map. This is something we got to play around with, is that map on the bottom left there shows the number of days with more than 10 centimeters of snow cover on the ground from July 2016 through June 2017. So we considered that our snow year. But this product is based off of a data set from the NOAA's National Operational Hydrologic Remote Sensing Center, or NOHORSI for short. And what it allows us to do is get a spatial and temporal look at snow cover across the basin. The downside is the Canadian grid of the model has only been available since about 2012, so we don't have a ton of years to work with. If you read the document, you'll see the years in there. But what it shows us is that the basin ranged anywhere from 1 day in the extreme southern areas with snow cover over 10 centimeters to up to more than 150 days in the northern reaches of the region. 2017, relative to this short period of record, snowfall was below average in all of the basins except for the St. Lawrence. And Lake Michigan basin experienced the largest departure with 16 fewer days of snow cover than average. One reason I went with this gridded model, just for context, is because it does give us this good spatial picture and a consistent physical frame of reference. Any of those familiar with snow observations a little more intimately know that they're few in terms of number. Not every station that takes weather observations takes snow observations. And over time, the record isn't all that consistent from site to site. So we're kind of dealing with a very pieced together record if we use station observations. So this was one that let us look more uniformly in space, but those caveats are worth noting. And with that, pass it on.
All right, thank you, Frank and BJ. So now we're going to move into the major climatic events section, which really focuses more on the tangible impacts or the events that were caused by some of the climate trends that were just described to you. And to talk about this section today, we have Jonathan Weaver with the Midwestern Regional Climate Center.
Yeah, thank you. For this section, as she already mentioned, this was really intended to just kind of be a large aggregate of all of the major climatic events that occurred over the course of the seasons in 2017. And as you can see, we did break it down by season so you can kind of get a good timeline of the course of events that maybe one led to another later on in the year and all that kind of stuff. But at the very least, you got a nice organized way of seeing all of that. And a lot of this information was largely taken from the Great Lakes Climate Quarterly reports that are generated with as was mentioned earlier on in this webinar, that is a much more collaborative binational effort. And so we take a lot of the events that are mentioned in those and we're able to aggregate that together. And so if we just kind of go through this section by section, you can kind of see that in the winter, as has been mentioned previously, the winter in 2016 and into 2017 was really highlighted with above normal temperatures. Indeed, several locations had experienced near to record-breaking warmth in both January and February, which incidentally led to a maximum ice coverage of only 15% compared to the long-term average of 55%. And then this, as a result, the reduced ice cover caused for the existing ice that was near the shoreline to erode the coastline in a lot of the different lakes, and especially along areas near Erie, Pennsylvania. And so moving right into spring of 2017, perhaps the biggest thing that we saw and has been mentioned previously is the record-breaking precipitation that a lot of locations saw. This record-breaking precipitation was also in conjunction with or it worked in tandem with the high water levels on Lake Ontario to cause a lot of flooding. And Lake Ontario actually experienced a record high rise in its water levels over the course of the spring, leading to a May that actually saw its highest water levels ever recorded since the records began in 1918. This, needless to say, had some pretty broad repercussions for the area, including some flooding along the coast and flooding of the Toronto Island Park, as you can actually see in that image there. And so these high water levels and high precip amounts actually remains throughout into the summer. Lake Ontario continued to set records on a monthly basis for the average water levels in both June and July. And then this, in combination with the heavy precipitation, led to some flash flooding across the basin. And then the flooding, in conjunction with the cooler temperatures, caused a lot of issues with farmers, especially during the peak growing season during the summer of 2017. Also, all of this rain and the flooding that occurred caused a lot of runoff, which actually led to a large expansion and a worsening of the harmful algal bloom that we see in western Lake Erie. And then moving right on into the autumn, autumn was mainly highlighted by a rapid transition from going from above normal precip in the spring and the summer into below normal precip, especially leading into later on in the fall season. This actually caused some harvesting difficulties for a lot of locations in the basin, especially in November. Lake Ontario, as a result, had its highest decline in water levels on record for the month of September, and this was primarily driven not only by how high it was previously, but also how dry it was in August and September by comparison. And then finally, we have near to record high water levels for Lake Superior in October and November by contrast, and we also saw the record highest wave ever recorded on Lake Superior at 8.8 meters or 28.8 feet. So that's kind of a good rundown and a good summary of the whole year of 2017 as far as major climatic events were concerned. And that's pretty much all I got.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. So now we'll move into the final page of the document that is meant to summarize Great Lakes climate-related work that was done in 2017. So to wrap up our document walkthrough with the new research, applications, and activities section, we have Brent Lofgren with the NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab.
Hi, this is Brent Lofgren. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
All right. So this section is sort of a rundown of research that was published in 2017, and it in some ways ends up being a laundry list. And I would point out that this means it was published in 2017, but not necessarily that the research is specifically relevant to 2017, but more is about long-term trends. And we had to make some decisions about what to include by space. And Because of that, we ended up doing just a one-sentence summary of each item that was there. And to highlight a few of them, there was one paper by Shui et al. This group is headquartered at Michigan Tech University, and they developed some improved methodologies for coupling atmosphere and three-dimensional lake dynamics in models. There's a paper by Wang et al., headquartered at University of Regina, and another one that took sort of a similar approach was Basile et al. From University of Michigan, and they ended up giving a little bit of conflicting information about predictions of future precipitation. So both of these papers showed increases in precipitation in general for the Great Lakes Basin in the next few decades, but once you get beyond about 2050, they diverge. So the Wang et al. Group was showing decreasing precipitation after that time. Basile et al. Were showing increasing precipitation persisting through the 21st century. There was another paper by Biyun and Hamlet at Notre Dame, and they were showing methods and results, data sets that were using statistical downscaling to give future projections based on some of the most current global climate models. So they've prepared data sets that are useful for the Great Lakes region. Then more in the area of impact, one paper by Collingsworth et al. Collingsworth himself is at Purdue, and it's a large group that was involved in this from really all over. They did a review paper that talks about the impacts of climate change on fisheries, and one of the major results that was given there is that high water temperatures promote fish growth as long as there is sufficient food, but it really leaves open the question of whether we should expect there to be sufficient food to maintain that growth. Meyer et al. From University of North Carolina looked into the economic impacts on hydropower production, mainly on the Niagara River, and they also looked at means to use insurance to reduce the risk of that. There's sort of an ongoing controversy about what sorts of projections to use as far as the water quantity in the Great Lakes altogether, and Meyer et al. Have used an older methodology that has brought up some questions about its validity. Another paper by Rempel and Hornseth of Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Energy. They looked at the influence of climate change on some birds, and they found that the eastern meadowlark and the wood thrush are detrimentally affected, and the hooded warbler, on the other hand, has essentially no effect. Then Rasmussen et al. From University of Michigan looked at strategies for climate adaptation in the face of political resistance and used the Great Lakes as a case study. So with that, I'd like to go to the next slide. And this will be sort of by way of going to anticipate the slide after this, but since this is the first annual of these, we've kind of looked at what sort of things should be included in here. And so far we've included literature that's from 2017 related to anthropogenic climate change, climate impact, and natural climate variability. Actually, sort of by happenstance, the natural climate variability item hasn't been hit very hard this time around, basically because of the papers that we found fit into the other categories instead. We talked about and so far have excluded terrestrial processes and paleoclimate, meaning climate trends that are using data that is derived from proxies and is looking at time periods of 1,000 years or more in the past. We've really excluded that so far. But we've also talked about other possibilities for future go-rounds of this publication and looking at including publications from a wider range of years. Several members of the committee kind of proposed other things, and in part it was due to lack of space that we excluded those. But really, anytime you're looking at just a single year in the scientific literature, you're kind of looking at a grab bag of topics, and a more consistent and stronger story might be developed over a longer period of time. So there's strength in going in both of those directions. Another thing we talked about is kind of implied in the title of this section that we really didn't use. So the title includes the words activities, and I relate that to studies in progress. So we really didn't include studies in progress by various offices, universities, government agencies throughout the basin, but only included them in terms of publications in peer-reviewed literature. So that's really all I have to say.
All right, thank you, Brent. And
all right, thanks.
Thank you to all of our speakers for walking us through the sections that you worked on. So we do want to give you an opportunity after this. We're going to open things up for discussion for anyone on the webinar who has questions or wants to provide feedback. But first, we wanted to touch on a few points that we've already received feedback on and are planning to adjust in potential future iterations of this annual summary. The first point is rather small but important. So we do list all of the data sources in the figure captions or the table captions that are used in this document, but we were asked to provide links to the actual data that was used. So in the future, we'll try to do that where it's possible, where the data that we used is publicly available, just to make it easier for people who are interested in pursuing the information in more depth themselves. And then we also received some feedback to consider adding a brief section at the end of the document explaining any gaps or deficiencies in the data that may have hindered the level or the quality of the information that we are providing. So, for example, BJ had described some of the temporal issues with the snowfall data. So things like that could be more explicitly pointed out in the document in the future so that people can know that about the information as they're looking at it. And then lastly, Brent touched on this a bit in the new research, applications, and activities section. We would like to have a better balance of the content that is included in that. So the 2017 version was very heavy on the published peer review literature, mostly because this was the first time that this document had ever been put together. We didn't necessarily have enough time to gather knowledge on other things to include. So in the future, we will solicit a call for activities or applications or in-progress work to include in this section. We'll solicit that call a lot earlier and more broadly than we did this year, so that hopefully we can have a better balance of the peer review and relevant meetings or workshops, any major adaptation efforts in the region, new projects being undertaken, and so on. Just a better balance of academia and other types of work that people will find relevant to this type of a product. So these are just a few examples of changes that we are already planning to make based on the feedback we received. So your feedback is valuable and it can lead to changes in future versions of this document. So that being said, we would now like to open the floor to anyone on this webinar today to ask us questions or share any feedback you might have. So thank you very much for joining us today to learn more about the product, and we hope that you find it useful, and we'd love to hear more from you about it. So we have a list of feedback questions here that you can respond to if you'd like. And we're mostly interested, or we're very interested in any feedback on the clarity and usefulness of the document, but any comments you might have would be helpful. And how we're going to go about this is that you can either type your question or comment into the chat box, and then we'll read it aloud and respond to it, or you can unmute yourself right now. So you should all be muted when you call in, but if you hit the microphone button on your screen, you can unmute yourself and you can just ask us your question or get your comment verbally. And so we'll be watching the chat box for any questions that roll in there, but right now the floor is open for anyone who has a question or comment.
Yeah, hi folks, this is Jeff Herder from New York. Interesting stuff. I like the way it was presented. The infographics were fairly clear, easy, understandable. Basic question: can we get the surface grids of the data that you showed on the maps?
I think that's a question for BJ or Frank, who would have worked with those figures.
Yeah. Kim, this is BJ. Yep. I'm not on mute, I don't think. Okay, yeah. Yeah, the surface grids for the temperature and precipitation, you may be able to get to those. We have to talk with some of the folks at the meteorology division in ECCC. They're the ones who provided those, so we did not have the raw data files, so we'd have to check with them. The snowfall data in its raw form is already available online from NOAA, but as far as the derived field, we could probably figure out a way to provide that. But
yeah, we'd be interested in the derived product. And you're not publishing any of those, publishing map services for any of those data sets, right?
I don't believe so, no.
And if we got those here in New York, we're in the New York Coastal Management Program, would we be okay with sharing those publicly?
Like the snowfall map? Yeah, I don't see why not. I'll have to go through my files and find them. They're on one of my hard drives. But if I'm not sure if my contact information was on the webinar, but if you go to the GLWQA webpage, get a hold of someone there, and we can talk about getting those over to you.
Okay, great. We'd love the Canadian data too, if we could.
Yeah, this is Frank from ECCC. Yeah, we'll when BJ gets in touch, make sure I'm in the loop there, BJ, and we'll try to see if Sylvain can hook us up.
Sure, great.
Hey, Sylvain.
Okay, and Jeff, okay. If you'd also like to leave your email in the chat box, I can get you in touch with BJ and Frank.
All right, great, thanks.
So Kim, I guess the report was perfect. No, if there's any more comments that come to you after you have a chance to further just kind of reflect or look at this, or maybe down the road in a few months you decide to go back to that report to pull some information. Of course, it's really accessible. Feel free to use those images as you need. Some credit would be nice. We'd welcome any kind of feedback, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again next year and moving forward. So I think at this point, unless there's any more questions, I'm looking in the chat right now. Oh, here's a question from Karina. How will this report change in subsequent years to depict trends over time? Is that a question for perhaps BJ and Frank?
I guess my initial answer would be just the graphs that are on page 3 and 4, I think, on the right side that have the past years. Will continue going forward in the future of those, and again, see how the most current years look at work with the trends that we're seeing. I guess that would be the easiest way that we would show this in the future.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. On the first page of the climate overview section, where you have the annual values and that large hydroclimate table at the bottom, I think the thing that would change there the most would be if a year had a really large anomaly from the trend over time or from the average. We'd integrate that into the discussion. The only one I can really see changing would be that snow data product if we decide to do something different or come across a different data set that might let us get a longer temporal picture. That might change entirely, but I think for the most part, it'd just be giving context to where the present year lies relative to the long-term trend.
But I also like to point out that we are open for suggestions. If there's something the person who asked the question or other people would say, oh, it would be good if you looked at this way and this data set in this regard, we would totally be open into looking at that and seeing how we could integrate that in the future as well.
Sure. Yes, definitely.
And this is Brent. I may be reading something into this question, but I'm going to sound a little bit of a note of caution about attributing trends over time to human-caused climate change. So, for example, the levels of the Great Lakes were very low from 1998 until 2013, and there was a lot of talk about that being due to human-caused climate change. And now that they're high, we get some questions from reporters asking the same thing, if that's due to climate change. So, those sort of speculations need to be taken with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I think most of what we're presenting here are what the actual trends are. I don't think we've done too much real attribution. That's more your deal, Brent.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm sounding some caution, like I said.
Yep, no, that's the deal.
For sure, yeah, no, attribution is tough, so.
And I think it will be important, that's a good perspective to make sure that we're not insinuating or inferring anything that we're not trying to do. Okay. With that, I'd like to just thank you all again, especially to our presenters, and Kim, BJ, Frank, Jonathan, and Brent. And with that, I wish you all a wonderful day, and feel free to contact us if you have any questions. The information is on the webinar. And and this will be recorded, and it will be posted on the GLESA website. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, and we can get a recording out to participants if needed. Thank you all.